that was an opportunistic thing that they began within really like one day. One day. Once it happened, Bush went to his advisors and said, okay, we got our new Pearl Harbor, we're going to start war on Iraq. And Richard Clarke, in his book, he was one of the people that was told we're going to start war on Iraq one day after 9/11. And he actually said, but Iraq was not behind the attack. If anything, it was, maybe Afghanistan because they trained there, but 15 of the 19 were Saudis. And of course, that was completely covered up. And to this day, there are still lies about the involvement of Saudi Arabia. There's been 28 pages withheld from the Joint Intelligence Committee that they're trying to get this out. And now the CIA Inspector General also has 30 pages that have been blacked out. Everyone thinks, and even some people who have read it say it's pretty damning about the involvement of Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia is one of our main allies in the Mideast on these wars. In fact, helping the terrorists, funding al-Nusra, which is a branch of al-Qaeda. Do you think if people knew these dumb questions about, we've got to do something, and if they actually knew that in many cases we are on the side of al-Qaeda and ISIS and the terrorists, do you think that would change their opinion and that they would put pressure then on the politicians to end this? I mean, because this isn't a real war. This is about control of a Middle East, and it's through terrible methods that are not actually, and I would actually be quiet too if they were working, but they are not working in the least. They're increasing the violence and the terrorism throughout the world, and in fact spawning brand new wars. We thought for a while that we had made a deal with Gorbachev, right? That we had ended the Cold War. The Cold War is back. The Cold War is back on steroids. Actually, now the main problem, I would even say above climate change. Climate change might kill us, but it might take maybe 20, 30 years before it really sets in badly. If they press the button right now, we're 2 minutes before doomsday, and we're going right up to the border of Russia. And if someone mistakenly thinks a drone or a flock of geese is the enemy attacking, this is going to be horrific. 18,000 nuclear weapons on both sides. My whistleblower friend Daniel Ellsberg that I was with a week ago for a week, that's his new book. And this is the number one really fear right now is just that this war, people are nuts, they're going to press the button. And it can actually, we were lucky to be alive because they came this close in the 70s and 80s to pressing the button, and even accidentally because of this warfare. So this should be kind of easy to explain to people. This should be kind of easy to explain that this mutual assured destruction is not bringing peace, love, and democracy to the world. In fact, it's endangering everybody. Todd talks about after 9/11, they began to write all the secret memos. No one knew at the time that John Yoo he was told to do this, by the way, but he also himself was very ambitious and very motivated to put the power in the executive branch and also to bend the rule of law. So he began writing for about 2 years. He wrote nonstop. There's dozens of these memos. Most of them have now become public, but not all of them. I like to quote this. I quoted it in Europe the week I was there several times because the people in Germany, Sweden even, and Norway, where I was, they all think the United States knows what it's doing. They're all following the lead. We were briefed that Sweden and Finland are probably going to join NATO. So they're all thinking this is great, we're following the lead of the U.S., and they have to realize that this is pretty god-awful what the United States is doing. So this one memo that I'll read from, John Yoo wrote about 3 weeks after 9/11, First Amendment speech and press rights may also be subordinated to the overriding need to wage war successfully. When a nation is at war, many things that might be said in time of peace are such a hindrance to its effort that their utterance will not be endured so long as men fight, and that no court could regard them as protected by any constitutional right. Okay, so this was a reaction to what happened during Vietnam. The Vietnam War was ended because there came to be political momentum. There was a strong, that was the main overriding factor, the political opposition to Vietnam. It started, pretty people were with it. They said Gulf of Tonkin, they were for it. They all had war fever when JFK put the advisors, and then they went to the Gulf of Tonkin. People were for it initially, but as it went on, year after year after year, the opposition went straight up. You had Jane Fonda and others going over to North Vietnam. You had Walter Cronkite in 1968 he had 60% of the American public watching him at the time, telling them that the war was unwinnable. And then you had Ellsberg leaking the Pentagon Papers. And finally, you had Nixon so paranoid that he overreacts. So you had all these things happening, and that long war came to an end. This war, it's exactly opposite. And the started off with quite a bit of momentum against war. Millions of people in the United States were marching. And now it's gone down. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Again, we need to talk because this is where the propaganda has been very powerful. And Americans, because it's an all, Shantae says, don't ever say this, I'll just say it the one time, because there is the all-volunteer military. Which isn't exactly true. They're duped. It's the all-duped military, or the all, fooled military, or something like that. All what? All recruited, but recruited even sounds too good.
Brainwashed.
Brainwashed, yeah. I mean, essentially they're being told, like Pat Tillman's a great example, that they're fighting for truth and justice, and they believe they're recruited by telling them they're going to save lives. They're going to kill the terrorists, fight evil, and whatever. So this is very strong propaganda. But the all-volunteer, taxes kept low, wars cost money. And this one is no exception, but instead of making every family in the United States pay around $100,000, that's what it comes to right now. Write this in your letters to the editor. If people realize that they would be paying $100,000 for the great joy and benefit of bombing Yemen and Pakistan and Afghanistan, do you think they would go along with this? Of course not. But you make it cost-free. So the national debt went from $5 trillion when Bush started this, after 9/11. The national debt was around $5 trillion. It went up under Bush to around $10 trillion. He doubled it in his term. Then Obama comes along, and now it's at 18 going on $19 trillion. Again, this is, it's invisible to us because it's just printing money. And people think, well, we don't have to pay that money back. It's just IOUs. They're meaningless. The truth is, some of the money is actually owed to China and Russia. Why do you think we're pivoting to China and trying to have new wars on China and Russia? Because we're not going to pay the money back. That's part of it. And so anyway, going back, no taxes. And then the third thing is, finally, eventually they realize that they won't even have troops on the ground. They will just do aerial bombing. It's not only drone bombing. Drone bombing is a big one, but there's a lot of just plain old bombing, as they did in Libya. So you'll often get the argument that drones are more surgical and more precise than carpet bombing. Does anyone debate? Does anyone recognize what that is in debate? When they make the argument that drones are better than carpet bombing? It's called a red herring. It means that you are making up it's a false issue. Of course, drones are better than carpet bombing. Don't anybody try to argue that. Carpet bombing is worse. Nuclear bombing would even be worse. But that's not what you're arguing. You're arguing that aerial bombing can somehow win the war. That this old Vietnam idea of taking out enemy troop, the key leaders of Al-Qaeda will somehow reduce the number of terrorists. It didn't even work in Vietnam. And of course it's not working now. For even our own generals said, for every person you take out, you are creating 10 or more. So this can't possibly work as a math proposition. That's what Robin and I have been trying to write in these drone things. But the bottom line is, when you tell people there are no costs, not even American casualties, of course everybody says the benefits Well, it generates jobs, especially in this area. People work for the military, they work for Raytheon, they work for Lockheed. All these things are causing jobs, and maybe they're getting us cheap resources, all that oil and gas. Who's been complaining when the gas prices went down in the last year? Nobody's complained. They went down very low. Everybody's been happy. So everybody believes that wars are actually helping Americans. As opposed to Vietnam, when none of these things were the exact opposite during Vietnam. And so I think that's one of the big answers. And then, of course, the other idea is they got much better in their propaganda. In Vietnam, now they have embedding the troops with the military. Our media actually benefits they benefit financially from this close relationship. Even NPR, our football teams are paid to advertise for military. I mean, they've gotten much better on the propaganda. That's the other reason. So, I mean, you've got to start thinking and brainstorming how we can think of ideas to overcome that. So Todd's talk, I keep going to my own talk from Todd's, but Todd's talk is about how during the Civil War period, you had martial law. And you actually had martial law, not just in the South. You know, people in the North would say, well, of course you have to have martial law in the South. That's our enemy. The North is fighting the South. No, the South didn't have martial law. The martial law existed in the North. And that meant, exactly as what John Yoo wrote, that they had to stop the presses. If you had editors criticizing Abraham Lincoln, our generals at the time rounded up editors. They were prosecuted and put in jail for any criticism of the North. This is part of the history. It's like Columbus. This is part of the history that nobody talks about during the Civil War. You see the Lincoln movie? Did we see that part about Lincoln rounding up the editors? There's a lot of bad things that happened during the Civil War, because wars do bring out the worst. And one of the things that they do is they have to crack down on the freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom of assembly. And now this is happening with our militarization. And you know, every time we've had a Black Lives Matter, you see the military out there in full gear. In our Republican National Convention, it was the same thing. That was one of the starts of it. So you see the police taking on this role, which means that we're not fighting them over there as much as we are fighting them here. The war comes back home. People aren't recognizing this quite yet. But the war that we think we're just bombing Yemen and these various countries is actually now beginning in the United States. And we're seeing a lot of the indirect consequences of being at war. And this is quite radical. I was going to write a letter to the editor and I didn't do it. But I will even say that the level of violence, this is probably the only audience I can say this to because people won't agree with this. But the level of violence that is now occurring in the United States, where we are getting a mass killing almost every week. And these are killings of school children and shootings at malls and certainly places of worship. And it's happening all over. This has tripled in the last 2 years. The FBI came up with a term. They didn't want to call it terrorism because then people might connect the dots. So they called it hostile, they came up with a crazy term. Mass hostile shootings or something like this. They're calling the one recently a hate crime instead of calling it terrorism. They're trying to keep people from making that connection. But what you expect when all we see in the United States is that killing and war can make you a hero. Mm-hmm. When we had American Sniper, that movie begins with the shooting of a woman and child. And the audiences were crazy enthusiastic for that thing. It garnered a ton of money. 60-some% of the United States think that they're support American Sniper. Well, what do you expect then when young, mostly, by the way, mentally challenged or mentally ill young men are living in this kind of environment, growing up playing violent video games, watching every Hollywood movie tell this completely crazy story about how killing in war is a hero does that. What do you expect is going to happen? they have a personal problem, the first thing they think of, I'll get a gun and I'll go shoot some people. That's what they do in the movies. And I think that this is pretty radical. I was going to write it up better for a newspaper than what I'm saying here, but I think this is part of the war blowing back home. Every country has mentally ill people. They do not have all the mentally ill people thinking that getting a gun and taking it, I can't get a date, so I'll go shoot some people. I mean, come on, there's something going on here. Michael Moore tried to ask this, and it's not just the availability of weapons either, because Switzerland has just as many weapons available. It's part of the problem, though, this glorification of killing and war for the military in order to keep that recruiting so that we don't have to have a draft. It's part of the whole thing. And it's a revering of violence. So all of these things are happening to us. The question to me is that, the t-shirt's wonderful. War hurts us all. How do we make people understand that the war is hurting them as opposed to trying to make them care about foreigners, especially when their own job and they believe their own well-being is actually benefiting from the wars. So how do you make people believe that this is actually now blowing back? There's the climate change, there's all kinds of terrible, terrible consequences. When Ken and I were talking on the way up here, we kind of agreed that a lot of it just turns out to be short-term versus long-term. Because if anybody can see what's happening in a larger sense, they would not go along with this because it's hurting them. You think you're starting a war on foreigners when it's actually becoming us. When the young Somalians and other people in our Twin Cities want to go fight so bad, and now they are out there in our neighbors and stuff. This isn't working. It's actually hurting us. So, a couple of the things these